Well, welcome. Good afternoon. We have the speakers on this time. Hi, I'm Aaron Stauffer. I'm the Director of Online Learning here at Vanderbilt Divinity School, and I'm really happy to welcome you to the final of our four-part series, Prophetic Power in the Public Square. We have a really wonderful panel today and a really interesting topic, the future of religion as we know it. So we're really excited to welcome you here. I'm going to introduce our moderator, Brittany Jackson, who is this Chief Operating Officer at Faith Matters Network, and really just a wonderful partner and collaborator and vision in this work. Brittany has been with us throughout every of these four conversations, and she's just been a wonderful holder of the space. So without any further information, I'll hand it over to Brittany.
Hello everyone, and welcome to those walking in. This is the last of the series, and I will say for me, this has been a really rewarding time to kind of be able to sit with some of the conversations that it feels like I'm back in school in a good way, sorry, in a fun way. And what I enjoyed so much about my Divinity School experience, being able to be in conversation with people, and this time with no homework. So I did have some homework. This conversation, just as a heads up, is being live streamed to the VDS something page, YouTube page, and also recorded. Please feel free to converse, to talk. I am more here for you than the camera, so this is, in the room conversation, and I'm really excited to be in conversation with this group on the future of religion as we know it. I've started each of these conversations the same way, and today I actually want to deviate. So as I was thinking about this conversation, the future of religion, I thought, first, what is the future that we are envisioning? And second, will we be able to reach it? Will we get to that future? Not can we, because I believe we can. It's just a will we. Do we have the resiliency, the fortitude to reach it? And I thought of one other story from my life that symbolized that for me. When I applied to undergrad, I actually only applied to one school, Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. Not a lot of people knew where it was because it's a state school with a regular name. And I spoke to all of my family members. I was really excited. And I got to talk to my great-grandmother, Alice, who was 70 years older than me. So she was probably in her late 80s at this point. And when I told her where I was going and what I was excited to do, she instantly knew where the school was, which was odd because she had, I don't think, finished high school. She had never been to college. And we hadn't really had a college conversation before that moment. And when I shared with her where I was going, she said, I know where that school is. I know where that place is. We weren't allowed to get off the bus there to use the bathroom. And she had been born in Little Rock, Arkansas. She traveled north to Muskegon, Michigan, where I grew up. And it was just a reminder of the things that we hope for the future. I'm sure she hoped that I would have access to great schools, to a different life than she had. And still, even in envisioning a future, it still brought up a past and a history. And it still had that type of meaning for someone that is a part of my own history. So even though I was really excited, when I got to campus, that moment never left, and it still hasn't. As we approach this conversation today of the future of religion, I'm just asking everyone to be mindful of what future means as we do push forward for hopefully a better future. I would like to invite our faculty now just to introduce yourselves, share what you are focusing on here at the Divinity School, your interests, and maybe just a little hope of offering of hope for a future that you're coming with today. And Dean Emily has decided on a first. Dr. Lisa, I welcome you into the conversation.
Thank you Dean Towns. My name is Lisa Thompson. I am the Associate Professor of Black Homiletics and Liturgics here at the Divinity School. I do a lot of work around those things of preaching and worship, and am most fascinated around things that even move beyond preaching and worship, around religious communication and rhetoric and its intersections with society and how folk make meaning. Lately, I've been working on a lot of things around Black women in the arts, and the question was about the future. My hope for the future, or maybe what I think of the future, is that it cannot wait. I think that's what I know most. If I know anything, that the future we most need cannot wait, and we don't yet know what it looks like. And so I'm thinking we need to be open to that.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Emily Towns, and I make decisions like Lisa gets to go first. I'm dean at the Divinity School, and I teach in the area of ethics and society. When I think about the future of religion, it would be really nice, wherever we sit in our various faith traditions, that we actually explored what I would call in Christianity faithfulness. Faithfulness to the traditions, knowing that that needs to change over time, but not spew things ad hominem and call that religious or of God.
So I'm Jim Hudup-Wemler, and you're right, this is really loud.
I warned them.
I teach American religious history. I've worked mostly on social and economic history of religion in the United States, and I also work with Presbyterian students on the things they need to know to become ordained and to become effective ministers. So we're always in that setting thinking about the future. And my very last class in Global Christianity 2 has always got a slide called Jim's Picks for the Future. And you know, there are things that are clear because of demographics. Really faithful 80-year-olds drop off the rolls, and people who might or might not go to church are being born today. But my hope for the future is actually that demographics aren't destiny, that younger generations will find good reasons to do what my dean has said, which is to exhibit and grow from faithfulness, the exercise of faithfulness, as opposed to just performing religion. Because performing religion gets you nowhere.
Amen to that. Just to give a little bit of an overview of the format today, we have a lot of folks in the room, and I'm really excited to see that. I'll be asking just one question for each of our panelists here. We'll spend about 20 minutes in conversation, and I'm really excited to get to your questions. I see that this topic has resonated with a lot of people, and I'm excited to talk about the future too. And once again, we will start with Dr. Lisa. The question that we have prepared for you is really around the church and theological education. And there's a lot of shifts happening in
It's like
those.
a dean's question.
It does sound like a dean question, but we invite everyone into this type of envisioning. So church leaders can't continue to build the religious communities as they've looked like in the past. How do leaders imagine something new, and what sort of practices and theological work needs to be done to meet the challenges of religious communities today? You have 2 minutes. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Thanks, Brittany, for the small question. Small questions, small things. I think that I will begin with maybe a thread that we had here already around assumptions around tradition and the past. I think we often assume that tradition doesn't change, When reality is that the only way tradition moves forward is through change, that we inhabit the tradition, we embody it. Every time we sing the hymn, it changes. Every time we do the prayer, it changes. Every time we gather, it changes. So I think one way of thinking about some of the things that may propel us forward is moving past the notion that there is something about preserving a tradition that means that it remains static, and somehow recognizing that tradition changes. And with that in mind, also recognizing that religion is cultural. It's a cultural phenomena, so we are not apart or separate from culture in that way. And with that tradition changing, to move forward, we think, gosh, Jesus followers have been around for 2,000 years. They aren't going anywhere in particular. So, I mean, once they went from followers to then there were house churches, this nomadic group of followers, house churches, and then these edifices and these gathering places. And at the same time, there are some things that remain the same. So being open to the fact that as the world shifts around us, we can maintain traditions without those traditions being static and the same. And I think as we think about that reality, then we have to get clear about, well, that faithfulness call. What are our values? What are we most committed to? Not what are we trying to retain? What are we just trying to preserve? But actually, what are the core commitments of faith traditions or of theological education or those of us who participate in this work? And then what does that look like in the shifting world around us? And to imagine that, I think we have to listen deeply to the world around us. How has communication changed? My goodness, the past 3 years have taught us how communication was already changing, and some of us just caught up with it, mindful, even including theological education, and those of us who are in the classrooms, including myself. So thinking about what does it mean then maybe that the sermon isn't the sermon, or maybe the litany isn't the litany it used to be, but the values are still there and it takes different shapes and forms. And also as we listen deeply, what do people care most about? And what matters most for them in life? If we think faith and religion are actually practical and have practical implications in the real world and everyday lives, then I think those are kind of key questions we have to ask and attune ourselves to some deeper listening. I think I'm a little beyond 2 minutes now.
No, I do have a follow-up question for you, though.
Oh,
I know.
okay.
It's a cheeky one because
Okay.
you brought something up,
Okay,
or you
let's get
said
cheeky.
something unintentionally, I think. If the church intends to move forward, and does the church intend to move forward? I'm wondering, Dr. Thompson, Dr. Lisa, are there some elements of religious communities broadly that seem to not be willing to move forward?
Cheeky, eh?
Yes.
I think there are some, I don't know, not willing to move forward, but I think there are some things that don't need to move forward. How about that? This is where I start. The ways in which we enclose ourselves off and have insular conversations, the ways in which we sometimes try, or religious communities, faith communities, including church communities, want to only be committed to what's most important to them and not in conversation with other faith communities, other religious communities, and things that are happening in the wider world. I do think those are things that we just can't afford to take forward. Because those are the places where we keep saying religion is dying or faith is dying. It's not. It's dying in that way, or people aren't participating in that way. And we must figure out well, where and how are people participating in order to move forward? If that is a round way of responding to your cheeky question.
No, thank you. Thank you for that. I will come off of you now. Well, good. Dr. Jim, I wanted to bring you into the conversation as well. And I do have to say, the book that you've brought today is the very first book I read in Divinity School. And I read The Divided Mind of the Black Church by the Reverend Raphael G. Warnock, front to cover, just that part, just the front part. And so first, I'm curious, why did you choose that text today? It's not the question I actually we had for you.
So I thought about it because it's a great answer to one version of what the future needs to be like, or what we need to do to have a future. And it's a book that's about how in the black church, piety is often opposed with social justice or public witness. And not surprisingly, for all of you who've listened to Raphael Warnock for any time at all, he thinks actually the secret sauce is an amalgam of the two. Think social gospel, think civil rights movement, but there's also all these opportunities for the academy to go one way, and for people who become preachers who say, I went to theological school, but it told me nothing about how to lead a church. And I will say something more about it as commendable to more than people just in the black church. I think it actually speaks to me and to the dilemma that we're sometimes in, trying to chase members rather than make members' lives meaningful and find new people for whom the exercise of religion could be meaningful.
Yeah, thank you. Part of the question that I have for you is around creativity. And at the time that book came out, we didn't have a Warnock in a Senate race, battle, we should say. But I'm curious about the ways in which you are seeing more creative works within religious communities, and if it's helpful outside of like a religious context. So I would think that it seems like you've mentioned this book in particular because there's more applications outside of just Ebenezer in Atlanta.
Yeah. I think creativity is something that the church leaders are always called to do, even though it's really easy to do the same thing if it seems to be working where you are. Okay? There's a lot of inertia in any religious activity. It's partly why it's a tradition, and the other part is it has fed the people you have right there. But if it's not reaching the people who aren't there, you got to look inside and say why. And there are all kinds of reasons why. I do this thing with my hands to illustrate a chart that's in The Future of Mainline Protestantism, a book that I edited. It goes like this: the church membership and attendance among the greatest generation is up here in the 80% range. And then you move down to my parents' generation, and they're falling off a little bit, but they're still in the 70% range. I'm a boomer. It's, in the 40% range in terms of likely to belong to a church. When you get down to my kids' generation, they're millennials. It's belong to a church is like 26%. Actually, there this week, it's like 13%. And we see this in all the sort of survey data about where do you feel you belong, and also in the sort of demographic stuff of who was there this Sunday. When they look at a whole county in Ohio, who were the folks there. And what does that tell me? It tells me there are lots of people who are in this culture who are raised by people for whom church or synagogue or Friday prayers at the mosque mattered, who aren't there now. And that's the kind of indictment from outside. So how do you get there? And I have an answer that I borrowed from the very first such one of these gatherings in theological education. Dean Emily will know the Beecher lectures were the first at Yale, were the first sort of lectures, the public presentation of some great ideas about how to improve preaching or the life of the church or what have you. And they were named after Lyman Beecher, and his son, Henry Ward Beecher, gave the very first one. And his message boiled down to this: multiply picnics. And you go, multiply picnics? His argument was that the churches were banking so much on the sermon that they actually needed to pay attention to the people in the pew, and they're having some Christian social experience with other people in their congregation. That the only way to bring people in was to bring people along with other friendships. There's something, there's something too easy sounding about that, except that they weren't doing it before. And that led into this great period of institutional churches and social gospel and other things that followed once they began paying attention to the members and would-be members and the needs of the community. And so I guess I would say, what's our version of multiply picnics? It can't just be playing for the sake of playing, but are there places where we need to be caught doing faithful religion that aren't Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, that would catch the imaginations of the people who are down here in the most recent generation, who are like, I get invited to church, but I don't know, should I go?
Yeah. This theme also that I'm hearing from you is, or I'm going to challenge a little bit and ask, are we actually using the right metric? So is attendance actually the metric in which we are now, should we be measuring religiosity?
Yeah, so I would pick up on that and say no. Faithfulness, there are a lot more people who are interested in religion, in my experience, than find themselves saying, yes, how do I become a member here? That is just, my wife has that job at Westminster Presbyterian. She, recruits people into membership or answers the question. But the really interesting interactions that we all get involved with are about where do you think we go when we die? Do trees have souls? All kinds of really deep theological questions that I find are more interesting as we go to the creative and curious end of the spectrum and away from the organized religion as we have known it, the spectrum of life.
Yeah,
Good
I've
question.
certainly thought the future, right? As we move closer and closer to the future, defining how we look at it. Do trees have souls?
I don't know, but trees demand a certain respect, and why did I go there? Because there are profound questions being asked by younger people that never would be asked by my generation and older about, what's our role on the planet? Even my generation isn't so quick to go to have dominion and multiply as once we were.
Thank you. It does actually lead well into the last question that I have for you, Dean, Emily. I compromised. And this is just the question of how did we get here? How did we form our ideas about religion, and in particular, what our religious communities look like? And what will it take to find an alternative?
I knew this question was coming, and I avoided thinking about it. But the thing that strikes me is when we do meaningful things, it's usually because there's some belief in them. There's some sense of seeking answers. And also, I think we're most vibrant when we're more ready to ask questions than to come up with answers. We got here because we didn't do those things, many of us. I don't think that's true for everybody in this room and the different churches and synagogues and community agencies and mosques. I don't think that's true for everyone. But I think in large part we have had a failure of imagination. And it is not fatal yet. There is still enough, and I'm taking a little bit of heart in seeing some of the election returns, that weaponizing faith doesn't always work. And it had at a certain point, but I think we've seen, as a body called the United States, that bad things happen when you do that. And so for me, how we move on is to actually, one, get serious about what our faiths teach us, which means actually learn what our faith traditions say, as opposed to the kind of hearsay that I hear oftentimes passing for deep religious thought, particularly in media outlets. The other way I think we move on, because we're already doing it in many spaces, is opening up our bodies, whatever that looks like, the structures that house where we are, to more than the main event, be it Saturday, Friday, Sunday, and the Holy of Holies, Wednesday night Bible study. That those things are important. They help many of us remember our identity, find our meaning, but we are to be, I think, so much more. So I like the idea of churches and other religious institutions being open. That's not always possible. Jim and I were talking about this on our way over. Right now, the Divinity School's a key card access only building. Why? Because there are folk out there who would come in and disrupt. And we are sitting isolated enough that it would take a while for help to come. That is also an indictment of where we are. So I like to, there's a long story I will tell very shortly. When I was working on my book on Black healthcare and healing, this is years ago now, and Jim Cone came to St. Paul School of Theology where I was teaching to do some lectures, and Cone was a health nut. A lot of people didn't know it, but the man ran miles in the morning. He would not go out to eat in restaurants because, as he said, he didn't know what they were putting in his food. He was serious. And so he was interested in this book, and he wanted to know where I was, and where I was stuck. Because I was in the last chapter, I knew all the bad things about Black health care. None of the statistics were helpful or hopeful, and I am not happy to say that has not changed in almost 30 years. And so I said, Jim, I don't know what to do. I know all this stuff, but I still have hope. And Jim, for those of you who never heard Cone speak, his theology was rather fierce, but Jim was a tenor. And so he rose up. We were driving in my car back from the airport. He rose up in his seat and he goes, Emily?
You have to have hope. You must have hope, because the only alternative is despair. And then they've won.
And I thought to myself, a word I will not repeat in here, you're right. I was never taught a day in my life to live my life in despair or even beside it. And 2 weeks later, the book was done because I realized hope was what formed me. I have hope about the future of religion being more vibrant, more alive, more faithful, more present, more open, more willing to ask questions and prod us into a better way of understanding. And now I'll flip, and this is my ethicist side coming out, the common good. Taking the common good and lifting it up once again, rather than the I want my's, which is where we seem to be living a lot these days.
I'll allow that to sit for a moment. I have a lot of other questions, but I am much more interested in what's coming up in the room. Do we have a fourth mic? Maybe not. I will turn it to the audience for any questions. I will ask Erin for help today so I can eat my sandwich. But please raise your hand. Help us get a mic to you. We have about 20 minutes, so let's keep it brief. Let's keep it cute. And if you wanted to hear a particular person, please feel free to direct a question to them directly. So, Racina, did you? I think Racina had something. She did. She does. Yeah, I just told you.
Thank you all for this conversation. I think my question is, what does creativity look like in practice? What are some practical things that each of us in this room could be doing that will support a brighter, more flourishing future?
I do, Racina, clarifying your question, where do we find creativity? How does it happen? Yeah, I think first of the thing, we actually have to tap into the places where creativity is happening and imagination is happening. As we are, I'm teaching this class now called Womanist Proclamation, Ritual in the Arts. Had to figure out the title quickly in my head. And this past Monday, students were reporting back on a field site visit that they'd done to our Afro dance class, West African dance class. And one of the things that in the reflective moment they were having was, actually, we realized dance is community. In the process of doing the thing, they were reflecting on the idea, dance as a practice of community and community forming. And one of the things that kept coming up then in the conversation was the reality in the places where we figure out how to make meaning. We say this all the time about preaching, about rituals, just any of the spaces where we have conversations, we're actually creating community right there in the midst. And who would have thought? It felt like it was the most radical revelation that dance was a form of community. But I thought, at what point when we were 4, 5, or 6, I always say this, is people teach us to stop imagining. That imaginary friend isn't real. Well, maybe let her have a friend. Let it be real for a moment. But at some point, we are taught that creativity and imagination, because we think this is an insult, is childlike. Can we recover the childlike curiosity? So my first kind of way into your question is this way of like, how do we revisit sites where creativity and imagination are alive? And this is when I think, gosh, what do we learn from the artists and the poets? The artists and the poets, who are in some ways their own prophets and reflect the world back to us, but do it in a way that it's vibrant, that we can experience it, and we have to pay attention. So I think that's one of the largest calls in terms of recovering creativity. It's a muscle, it's an intellectual faculty, and we often dismiss it for that thing that we call the rational, but it's worth rediscovering.
Yeah, my version of an answer to what should we be doing is I would be, if I were leading a congregation, I would be looking for other people to do the following, which is to engage in some form of activism or service that actually does appeal to younger generations. People I know as undergrads at Vanderbilt, and my own children and nieces and nephews, they give a lot of time to other people. And I think they intersect with our faith traditions is that love of God and love of neighbor stuff. And so if we lead with what folks are good at, helping other people, and then notice that the reason a lot of people are here is because of their faith tradition, we have the basis for creating a future to get an intergenerational, maybe even interfaith future together of working towards a life worth living in a place that's kind of broken and fearful, and get our way out of the broken and fearful place and into that was good. Where do you say you worship? I might check that out. That's institutional, but even the most important thing would be do something.
Hi. I am at West End United Methodist Church, just across the street, which is a big church, stained glass windows, organ, choir, the liturgy, a lot of tradition. I appreciate so much what you said about we embody the tradition. And I feel like I'm living in this moment of paradox in which when I think about the future, I like to think about we don't really need buildings, all the money that goes to maintain a building and pay staff and all of that could be channeled in other directions. And yet, we've had people come who are unhoused and worship with us and say it's just to be in a beautiful space really means something. And to have, I think the community and connection and intergenerational connection is so vital. Where else could we gather? And so those are some of the things that I wrestle with in the amount of resources that go toward buildings and staff and programming. And yet at the same time, the value and the beauty and how do you see our way through that sort of paradox?
I really believe it's not either or. I think the paradox is, and we just live into it with as much vigor as we possibly can, both all the elements of the paradox. That's my first thought, but backing up a little bit and trying to link it to your question, Carol, is stop hanging out with people who look just like you, think like you, act like you. I mean, if all you see is yourself, it's kind of hard to generate unless you're an extreme narcissist. And then I don't think I want to hang out with you at all. But there is this sense in which we have gotten into our faith lives an either-or mentality. And I really, really believe deeply that what I get most from sacred scriptures, particularly the Bible, is both and. You know, some of these folks that we see in the Bible, they're problematic. And our response is often to gloss it over. But no, dwell with the side that is not good as well. So I would say just briefly, live in the paradox. West End is really my home church. We're there on video every morning, every Sunday just about. But it just strikes me when I think about the worship experience of West End, and then having lived through the 5-hour funeral for Calvin Butts at Abyssinian Baptist last Friday. And it was 4 hours and 58 minutes because they had the timer going so you could see it. Both those things are necessary. Both those understandings of worship and remembrance and moving on, because they had to do a lot of, okay, he's gone. He's gone after 50 years. Who are we going to be now? And I think that's what many of us are asking, even if we haven't had a leader die. Where are we going now? So do the paradox. It's a good thing.
I appreciate the do the paradox. I also, this idea, this goes back to the question of creativity, that everyone has to do it the same way. I think it's about doing the paradox. In reality, we live in structures that are not going to be toppled today. So, I mean, we live in capitalistic structures. We live in kind of things that are, we still participating in these things, and they aren't going away today. I guess some of the questions always come back to is how are we participating in what we have at hand? And I think it's more about, well, how do I make use of this building? If we're actually going to have the building, and also another community saying, well, we actually don't have to invest in a building project because that's not actually our mission, and that being okay. I think when we get into the rut of everyone has to do it this way is where we actually get into the most trouble. And that there's room for the movement chaplain, there's room for the traditional church structure, there's room for the diffused community that is participating in the brunch ritual, whatever they're doing, but there's room, and it takes all of this to actually move the work forward.
I'm Melissa Smith. I'm an Episcopal priest at Christ Church Cathedral downtown. And once I realized that COVID was not going away, I was so encouraged by the possibility. And I wondered if God was inviting us to do something really different and to give us this great pause to throw out the bathwater, keep the baby, and remake church. And I thought a lot of the things I saw in different places during this season have been extraordinary. Small groups and book Zooms and caring for one another and potting up. And I saw church, people would come and feed people outside who hadn't come to church in years. And I saw curiosity being awakened. I saw people wanting to know what their lives meant, what faith had to do with how they were living in the world, what their mortality was like. I just saw so much potential. And I think what was very hard for me was that we just wanted to get back to church. We just wanted to get back to the way things were. And this incredible invitation we'd been given was, you know what, let's just go back to the way things were. Let's go back to the main event. All these other things that we did to sustain us were just to fill in the spaces. And what I'm wondering from you experts is, where in history has this happened? Where in Scripture has this happened? Where in our various traditions or our other religions and cultures has there been a great invitation that was actually RSVP'd yes? Is this just, because I know it's not just the institution or the Episcopal Church or mainline that is feeling this sort of like we're not back. and I don't really want to go back. And what was so great about what we were doing before anyway? And I'm struggling because I can't figure out why we didn't take the invitation. And I'm wondering if there are places in history or scripture or traditions that we can look to now.
3 places that strikes me. The Black Death was, nobody wants that, but it led to villages emptying out and people having to decommission churches and establish them in different kinds of places. And as a result, the religious orders took on new work and a certain vitality that paid off for centuries afterwards. I don't want to wish that on us, but COVID didn't last quite long enough for that kind of creativity that you observed to become the new way of doing religion. And we may have been a little too well-resourced in terms of land and staff and budgets to see a critical change. But let's think about some other times that there have been great changes. And I'll just point to one now, which is I'll do two. The hush harbors of the black church in the Deep South, where because the sermon was always in the white lead version was slaves obey your masters, even if there was another text, it generated an alternative. Maybe we need some alternatives to who we are as ecclesial entities, and be willing for the greater glory of God for some other expression of church to take over. The last one is the institutional church movement, because cities were short of space and full of needs. Like immigrants needed to learn English. People needed jobs. Abyssinian was built the way it was built to be it wasn't quite 24/7, but it was all 7 days of activity. And maybe all of this, capital-intensive religion, we all have bigger buildings probably than we need, can be turned back towards the great need for our society to have public places where people can meet. You can hardly go to the school anymore. That's contested space. Malls are closing. Everything, capitalism is taking over pretty much every space it can, except for our homes, and then it charges us more for our homes. There's an opportunity there that's not unlike 100 years ago for churches to open up and not constantly say, what's in it for us, but instead say, who could benefit from what we have?
Thank you, Dr. Jim. I think we have time for just one more question. Okay, I wasn't sure if it was a hand or a goodbye. Hello, my boss, Jen.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jen Bailey. I think the question I want to ask you all is around the role of formation in the future of religion. And so I will give a very concrete example, because I'm looking at so many people in the room. Lissa was my field ed advisor. Dean Towns is a mentor. My rabbi's here, right? Like, I'm thinking in particular about my son. So I have a 2-year-old, Max, who is coming up at a time, well, Christina knows him. He's a lot. He's a wonderful kid. But he's coming up being raised by a black mother and a Jewish father, with Judaism being his primary religious home, even as his mama is a preacher in the black church in the South at a time of rising anti-Jewishness, anti-Semitism, and anti-black racism, and a whole lot of despair about the future of our climate, right? And whether or not there is actually going to be anything for him to inherit. And so I'm holding that existential angst alongside this question for me of so I'm holding that despair alongside the hope, right, that is intrinsic in my own tradition, but wondering about the role of formation in cultivating resilience in a moment that is defined by despair so that we can have the hope to get to the creativity of the other side. Knowing that there's a whole lot more death yet to come, right, if we're honest about the despair and the conditions we find ourselves in. And so I guess my question to you and to the room is, what is the role of spiritual formation that is not just about the formation I got, which I loved, right, in Sunday school where I'm memorizing Bible verses, but is about a type of spiritual fortitude that we're cultivating from a young age across our faith traditions. I think each of the traditions have something to say about that. And what does that have to do with the future of religion?
Good question, good question.
Your question made me think, how did I learn this stuff? And I think there are two things. I got a steady diet in all of the religious communities I grew up, whether it was Asbury Temple United Methodist Church, the little church by the side of the road where everybody loves somebody and Christ is the Lord, to my grandmother's Mount Zion AMEZ church. And it was, you are a child of God, God loves you, do something about it. And what made that stick was watching adults I respected actually live that out. I saw what it looked like to lean into your faith and really have your actions shaped by it. That's the kind of spirituality I think that's built to travel and helps us along.
I wasn't prepared. The question of formation, I think we're always being formed one way or another, and sometimes it's malformation. I appreciate this idea of steady diet. I too had steady diets, and some things could have been taken out of the diet from time to time. And I'm grateful for it at the same time, but I think when I heard your description, I thought, I want to be in whatever community that kid grows up to be in, because how amazing this person is going to be to have a mama and a daddy in terms of being, but faithful, back to these words are faithful, but to actually see people disciplined into different traditions, but not in ways that they're competitive, but somehow to have an individual formed in community to understand that these things can coexist together without them being competitors, without one being deemed evil or unnecessary. That is, I mean, those are the people we lack today. I think because of those uneven diets that I think that will help us live better alongside of that reality of despair. To know that it's not about always having the answers, but sometimes being curious to ask the questions that's going to lead us to those better pathways of hope.
So one kind of formation, actually, I think, is of people who claim a congregation or a religious practice or a Thursday meditation to start practicing a kind of radical inclusion. This past weekend, I was doing a session retreat for Presbyterians, and I had written DEI alongside one particular provision of a book of order, and I won't go too much into it, but somebody said, "What is that?" And I was just thinking Vanderbilt, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and trying to, trigger myself to say, your church has deeper reasons to do this than it's a buzzword inside a corporate culture. Inclusion is pretty much every religious group's thing. but you don't know it walking in cold as a visitor. And so one thing that religious leaders could be doing, from pulpits and educational things, is to constantly uncover why it is that we're so darn welcoming, so that when somebody gets a steady diet of religion, they know that's the thing. They may not know, be able to parse the Trinity or anything like that, but they know that radical inclusion with other people is like the best thing about religion, and then they can work out the rest of it from there. I would hope that for, your son, for my grandchildren, et cetera.
Thank you, and thank you all. Thank you for your questions. I know we are coming up on time, and please feel free if you need to depart to start to do so. But I do have one room exercise for us to close out this space. And it's participatory because that's one of my favorite things about my tradition is you're expected to respond. So as we close out today, I would like us to envision our future together, and not 5 years from now and not 10 years from now, but I'm thinking 3 or 4 generations from now, when we either are not even a memory, but definitely not thought of. So far, far out in the future. And my first question for you in this time when you are no longer here is, what is it that you hope remains from your religious community? Whatever it is from your own religious tradition, what is it that you hope remains? We like to talk, so in my tradition, please say it into the room so that others can hear. What is it that you hope to see? Keep going.
Celebration.
Mutual delight. Community meals.
Mm-hmm. Keep going.
Welcome.
Mm.
Communal celebrations of death and birth and transitions and seasons.
I'll invite us into our second question. What new things would we imagine are a part of our religious communities?
Sharing resources. Safety.
I'll add space. My tradition would also say there's like 2 more on this side, and then we'll close out. There's like 2 more over here. Something's there. I might offer and close out with that the power in the room mirrors the people in the room. So, as we close out the series and as we close out today, thank you all for coming. Thank you for your contributions and your questions. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Jim and Lisa.